I was strapped to a hospital gurney, bleeding inside my own body, when my mother decided a concert mattered more than my 3-year-old twins. I had 45 minutes to find someone before their babysitter left, and the only thing my family sent back was a text calling me a burden. That was the moment I stopped paying for their life. My name is Myra Whitmore. I'm 34, I'm a cardiology resident, and I have twins named Lily and Lucas, who were 3 years old when all of this happened. People hear doctor and assume your life is put together, like the title somehow pays your bills, watches your kids, repairs your sleep, and gives you a backup plan when everything falls apart at once. It doesn't. Most days, I was running on hospital coffee, 4 hours of sleep if I was lucky, and the kind of exhaustion that makes you forget whether you ate dinner or just packed dinner for the kids. But I still kept going because that's what I'd always done. I kept going through medical school, through pregnancy, through their father walking out when I was 5 months along, through residency, through daycare costs, through fevers at 2 a.m., through board exams with 2 babies at home. And through all of that, I still somehow made sure my parents' mortgage got paid on the 1st of every month. That part sounds unbelievable when I say it now, but at the time it felt normal. That's what bothers me the most. My parents, Helen and Richard Carver, had trained me so well that I didn't even call it being used. I called it helping. I called it being responsible. I called it not making things harder for everybody. My older sister Vanessa was always the one they celebrated. She was the beautiful one, the creative one, the one Mom would cry over because she had so much pressure on her. When Vanessa wanted to go into fashion design, Dad acted like she was building an empire from scratch. When I got into medical school, he said, "That's practical," like I had chosen a decent used car. I laughed it off. I told myself Vanessa needed praise because her world was unstable and mine was solid. That was the lie I lived under for years. I was solid, so I didn't need anything. I was capable, so I could be skipped. I was strong, so they could take from me and still act like I was the one asking too much. The first mortgage payment happened 8 years before the accident. Dad called me one evening, and I could hear that fake, embarrassed tone people use when they already know you're going to say yes. He said they were in a tight spot, just this once, and asked if I could cover $2,400 before the bank charged a late fee. I was barely out of medical school. I had loans stacked over my head and rent due, but they were my parents, so I sent it. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed afterward, looking at the confirmation screen and feeling proud in this sad little way. Like maybe this was how I finally proved I wasn't second place. Just this once became every month. Then came $800 for health insurance after Dad said his coverage changed. Then came car repairs, a roof leak, a furnace, an emergency credit card bill they said they couldn't handle because Vanessa had needed help with a design opportunity. I never got front row seats or proud Facebook posts. I got invoices disguised as family. And I kept records. I used to feel weird about that, like keeping a spreadsheet meant I was secretly resentful or cold. But every month, after I transferred the mortgage payment or covered another temporary problem, I entered the amount into a file on my laptop. Date, reason, amount, confirmation number. Maybe some part of me was waiting for the numbers to explain what I couldn't say out loud. Maybe I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining the one-way street. By the time of the accident, the total was already past $300,000. I had paid enough to change my children's future, and somehow I was still the daughter who got parking lot photos, canceled visits, and, you understand, don't you? My parents missed my medical school graduation dinner because Vanessa needed emotional support after a meeting. They didn't come when I had the twins. They didn't come when I was alone in the hospital during a pregnancy scare. But the transfers kept going through, quiet and automatic, like my love had been set up on autopay. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening after a 16-hour shift. I was tired, but not careless. I remember the green light. I remember starting through the intersection. Then there was this awful sound. Not like in movies, not clean or dramatic, just metal and glass and my own breath getting knocked out of me. A truck had run the red light and slammed into my side. When I came to, Marcus Smith was leaning over me in the ambulance, saying my name like he was trying to keep me attached to the world. Marcus was an ER doctor at my hospital, someone I'd worked with for 2 years, someone who had seen me calm in other people's emergencies. I tried to sit up because my first thought wasn't my spleen or the blood pressure cuff or the pain cutting through my abdomen. It was Lily and Lucas. Their babysitter left at 8 p.m. It was 7:15 p.m. I had 45 minutes to solve my children's safety while doctors were preparing to open me up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I called Dad first because even after everything, some stupid part of me still believed emergency meant family. He answered, sounding irritated, like I had interrupted dinner. I told him I had been in an accident. I told him I was going into surgery. I told him the twins needed someone for just a few hours. There was a pause, then muffled voices, Mom's sharper tone in the background, and Vanessa laughing at something I couldn't hear. Then the call went quiet. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed with a message in the family group chat. It was from my mother. "You've always been a nuisance and a burden. We have Taylor Swift tickets with Vanessa tonight. Figure it out yourself." I stared at it until the letters stopped looking like words. Then Dad added, "You're a doctor. You're used to hospitals. Don't make this into a bigger deal than it needs to be." Vanessa didn't type a sentence. She just sent a laughing emoji. Marcus saw my screen before I could hide it, and his face changed in a way I'll never forget. He didn't pity me. It was worse than that. He looked like he finally understood something I had been refusing to understand for years. I didn't cry in the ambulance. That sounds strange, but I didn't have the space for it. I had 2 toddlers at home, a babysitter who had already stayed later than planned twice that week, and a surgeon waiting somewhere inside that hospital. So I did the thing my family had spent years teaching me to do. I solved the problem while they treated me like the problem. I asked Marcus for a phone with internet because mine was almost dead, and he handed me his without making me explain anything. I called the first 24-hour nanny service I could find, gave them my address, my sitter's name, the twins' routines, the emergency contact list, the door code, everything. I paid triple the normal rate without even blinking. The woman on the phone was kinder to me in 4 minutes than my own mother had been in 34 years. When I handed Marcus his phone back, my hands were still shaking, but my voice had gone flat. I asked him to take screenshots of the group chat before my phone died. He looked at me for a second, not in a nosy way, more like he understood that I was asking for something bigger than a screenshot. Then he nodded and did it. He sent the images to himself and to my email while the ambulance doors opened and the hospital lights hit my face. I remember thinking how humiliating it was that a coworker had seen that message. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because now someone outside my family had seen the shape of my life. He had seen me begging for help and getting called a burden while I was being rushed into surgery. There was no way to dress that up. There was no way to make it sound less ugly. The surgery took 4 hours. I was told later that if things had gone a little differently, if they had waited too long or missed the bleeding, my kids might have lost their mother that night. I try not to sit with that thought for too long, because it still makes my chest tighten. I spent 5 days in the hospital after that, sore, drugged, and moving like my body belonged to someone else. The nanny service sent me photos of Lily and Lucas eating breakfast, coloring at the kitchen table, sleeping with their stuffed animals tucked under their arms. I saved every picture. Not one message came from my parents. Not one call from Mom asking if I survived surgery. Not one text from Dad saying he had overreacted. Not even Vanessa pretending to be concerned for appearance's sake. They had gone to the concert, and from what I later heard, they posted photos. Mom had one caption about a magical night with our girl. I was in a hospital bed when I saw it, and I just turned my phone face down. On the third day, a nurse named Brenda found me sitting up too straight, trying not to pull at the IV line while I opened my laptop. She said, "Honey, whatever work email you're about to answer, it can wait." I told her it wasn't work. She didn't ask again, just adjusted my pillow and told me not to overdo it. I logged into my bank account and stared at the automatic transfers like I was looking at a machine that had been running in my house for years without me hearing it. $2,400 on the 1st, $800 on the 15th. Extra payments scattered between them, all labeled with boring names like repair, insurance, loan help, urgent. I canceled the mortgage transfer first, then the insurance. Then I removed my parents from every payment app, blocked their numbers, blocked Vanessa, and left the family group chat. There was no dramatic music in my head. I didn't feel brave. I felt tired and very awake. Marcus came by later with coffee I couldn't really drink yet. He stood near the end of the bed, careful not to act like we were suddenly close just because he had witnessed the worst text message of my life. I appreciated that. He asked how I was feeling, and I almost said fine because that was the answer I always gave. Instead, I said, "I think I'm done." He didn't ask done with what. He just nodded once and said, "Good." That one word did something to me. Not because he was saving me or telling me what to do, but because someone had finally heard the situation and didn't ask me to understand their side. He didn't say, "Maybe your mom panicked." He didn't say, "Maybe Vanessa didn't know." He didn't try to shrink it into a misunderstanding. He just let it be as bad as it was. When I got home, everything felt too normal, and that almost made it worse. The twins ran to me carefully because the nanny had told them Mommy had a big owie and needed gentle hugs. There were toys under the couch, tiny socks in the hallway, half a cup of apple juice on the table. And for a second, I had to hold on to the kitchen counter because I was back in the same apartment, but not the same person. The first week was hard. I moved slowly. I couldn't lift the kids the way I wanted to. I had to let people from the nanny service come in and out of my home, and every invoice stung because I knew I had been paying my parents enough to afford help like that many times over. But I also noticed something that made me almost angry. Without those automatic payments going out, my budget suddenly had room to breathe. My money had been leaving my life so quietly that I hadn't even understood how trapped I was. 2 weeks after the surgery, on a Saturday morning, I was making pancakes for Lily and Lucas. The kitchen smelled like butter, and Lucas had pancake batter on his pajama sleeve because he insisted he was helping. Lily was sitting on a chair with one sock on, one sock missing, singing to herself like nothing in the world had ever been unsafe. Then someone knocked on my door. 3 firm knocks, not delivery knocks, not neighbor knocks. My stomach dropped because I thought my parents had finally noticed the missing money and decided to show up angry. I wiped my hands on a towel and looked through the peephole. It wasn't my parents. It was my grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, standing straight-backed on my doorstep in a dark coat, holding a cream-colored envelope in one hand. I hadn't seen him in almost 3 years because Mom always had a reason why visiting was inconvenient. When I opened the door, his eyes went straight to my face, then to the way I was holding my side, and his jaw tightened. He said, "Myra, I know enough, and next Saturday the rest of the family is going to know too." Grandpa Thomas didn't say that like a threat. That was what made it worse in a way. My parents yelled when they were scared. Vanessa smiled harder when she felt cornered. Grandpa just sat at my kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee, and watched Lily try to convince him that pancakes counted as dinner, too. He listened to her with his full attention, like a 3-year-old's pancake argument mattered. I remember standing by the stove with one hand on my incision and thinking, this is what it looks like when somebody chooses to be present. Not because it helps their image, not because they need something, just because they showed up. He waited until the twins were busy with blocks in the living room before he opened the envelope. It was an invitation to his 70th birthday party, the kind of formal family event my parents treated like a royal command when it suited them. Cream cardstock, raised lettering, the whole Whitmore side of the family invited. I told him I didn't know if I could go. I was still recovering. I didn't want a scene. And honestly, I didn't know how many people had already heard some twisted version of what happened. Grandpa looked at me for a long second and said, Myra, people have been hearing twisted versions about you for years. That landed harder than I expected. I almost argued with him. I almost did the thing I always did, where I made my own pain sound smaller so the room could stay comfortable. But he reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded printout on the table. It was the screenshot Marcus had taken, the burden text, the concert excuse, the laughing emoji. Seeing it on paper made it feel less like a bad dream and more like evidence. Aunt Eleanor was the one who had called him. She was my mother's younger sister, loud when she needed to be, blunt all the time, and permanently unpopular with my parents because she refused to pretend our family was healthier than it was. She had heard about the accident through one of my cousins and started asking questions. That was Eleanor's dangerous habit. She asked questions people depended on nobody asking. When she found out I had been in surgery and my parents hadn't gone to the hospital, she called Grandpa. When she found out about the text, she called him again. And when she found out I had been sending money for years, she told him, "You need to see this before Helen and Richard turn that girl into the villain." Hearing that made my face burn. Not because Eleanor was wrong, but because I knew she was right. My parents were not going to come to me with shame. They were going to come with a story. Grandpa asked if I still had records of the payments. I almost laughed because, for once, my anxious little spreadsheet habit was useful. I showed him the file on my laptop. At first, he just read silently, scrolling through the rows, his expression tightening with every year that passed on the screen. Mortgage payments, insurance premiums, car repairs, home repairs. Transfers marked Vanessa emergency that I had half forgotten about because there had always been another one behind it. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't gasp or perform outrage. After a while, he sat back and said, "Do you understand what this shows?" I said it showed I had helped them. He shook his head. "No, it shows they built a lifestyle on your silence." I hated that sentence. I hated how cleanly it cut through every excuse I had ever made for them. For the next few days, I printed everything. Not because I wanted to humiliate anyone, even then I didn't want that, but because I knew my parents would deny whatever wasn't nailed down. I printed transfer confirmations, bank statements, insurance invoices, emails from Dad asking for temporary help, texts from Mom saying they were under stress and Vanessa couldn't handle one more disappointment. I put it all in a plain manila folder because anything prettier would have felt ridiculous. Aunt Eleanor came over 3 days before the party and sat at my kitchen table with a pen, adding totals on a yellow legal pad. When she reached the final number, she stopped moving. $364,000, give or take. She looked up at me and said, "Myra, that is not helping out. That is supporting a household." I wanted to say I knew that. Instead, I pressed my palms against the counter and said, "I just didn't want them to struggle." Eleanor's face softened, but her voice didn't. "They were fine letting you struggle." That same evening, my cousin Rachel texted me. We were not close, which made the message feel even stranger. She said Vanessa had been telling people I had been acting erratic since the accident, that I had cut off Mom and Dad for no reason, and that everyone should be gentle with me because I was not in a stable place. I sat on the edge of my bed and read that message 3 times. There it was. The story had started without me. They hadn't called to ask if I was alive, but they had found time to call relatives and make sure I sounded unstable before I ever opened my mouth. That was the part that changed something in me. The text in the ambulance had broken the old arrangement, but Rachel's message showed me they were still trying to use it. They wanted my money, my silence, and if they couldn't have those, they wanted my credibility. By the time I drove to Grandpa's house the next Saturday, my hands were sweating against the steering wheel. His place sat on 3 acres with white columns, a wraparound porch, and that old family quiet that made everyone lower their voice without being told. Cars lined the driveway. Through the front windows, I could see balloons, waiters, relatives, the kind of polished gathering where my mother knew exactly how to perform. I wore a simple navy dress because I didn't want anyone saying I came dressed for war. The manila folder was in my bag. Lily and Lucas were in the back seat, excited about cake, and too young to understand why Mommy had been quiet all morning. Before we got out, I turned around and looked at them. Lucas had one shoe half off. Lily was holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. I almost drove home. I really did. Then I remembered my mother's sentence. You've always been a nuisance and a burden. I put the car in park, picked up the folder, and walked toward the house. Inside Grandpa's house, everything looked too polished for what was about to happen. There were silver trays moving through the room, champagne glasses, flowers on every table, and relatives laughing in little circles like nobody had ever said anything cruel in a family group chat. My parents were near the fireplace. Dad had on his best navy suit, the one he wore when he wanted to look respectable, and Mom was in a cream dress with pearls at her throat. Vanessa stood close to them in a designer dress, smiling like she had been born under perfect lighting. For a second, I saw them the way everyone else probably did. A proud family, well-dressed, warm, successful. Then Mom saw me, and her smile dropped so fast it almost made me laugh. Vanessa recovered first, of course. She crossed the room with that smooth, floaty walk she used at events, and kissed the air near my cheek. "Myra," she said, loud enough for nearby cousins to hear. "You made it. We were so worried after your little accident." Little accident. I was still healing from abdominal surgery, and she said it like I had bumped my bumper in a parking lot. I shifted Lucas on my hip and said, "It was a ruptured spleen and internal bleeding. I almost died." Her smile held, but it got thinner. Mom stepped in before Vanessa had to answer, putting a hand over her chest like the sight of me was emotionally difficult for her. "Honey, we didn't know it was that serious," she said. I looked at her for a moment and almost asked, "Did you ever try to find out?" But the room was already watching, and I wasn't ready to spend my first 5 minutes defending the fact that surgery counted as serious. For the first half hour, they acted like people trying to control a fire by smiling at it. Dad introduced me to a cousin's husband as our daughter, the doctor, which would have sounded nice if he hadn't immediately added, "She's been under a lot of stress lately." Mom kept touching my arm in this soft, public way she never used in private. Vanessa hovered near groups of relatives and lowered her voice just enough that people leaned in. I caught pieces of it while getting fruit punch for the twins. After the accident. Not herself. Cut everyone off. We're just concerned. It was clever, honestly. They were not calling me crazy outright. They were making concern do the dirty work. Every time someone glanced at me with that sad, careful look, I felt the old urge to explain myself rising in my throat. Aunt Eleanor appeared beside me near the dessert table. She didn't hug me right away. She just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, like she was letting everyone see I was not alone. "They've been working the room since before you got here," she said under her breath. "Helen cried in the powder room for an audience. Richard told 3 people you stopped helping them because trauma changed your personality. Vanessa is pretending she's scared of you." I felt my fingers tighten around Lily's paper cup until the rim bent. I wanted to walk straight over there and say everything. I wanted to pull out the folder and dump every page on the floor. But across the room, Grandpa Thomas caught my eye from beside his chair. He gave one small shake of his head. Not yet. So I breathed through it and handed Lily her juice, like my whole family wasn't trying to bury me while I stood 10 feet away. Then Vanessa overreached. She always did when she thought the room belonged to her. I was helping Lucas pick up a napkin he had dropped when her voice rose, not by accident, across the room. "I just hope Myra gets help," she said, soft and tragic, to a cluster of aunts and cousins. "Being a single mom is hard, and I think she's turned a lot of resentment toward Mom and Dad. They've sacrificed so much for her." That sentence made the air leave my body. Sacrificed. My parents had been living on my money for 8 years, and Vanessa stood there in a dress I was almost sure my parents had helped pay for and told people they had sacrificed for me. One of my older aunts looked over with pity and said, "Poor thing, she always was sensitive." I had heard some version of that my whole life. Sensitive meant inconvenient. Sensitive meant you noticed what they needed you not to notice. Grandpa stood up before I could decide whether I was going to say something stupid. The room quieted almost immediately, not because he demanded it, but because people still reacted to him like he was on a bench. He tapped his glass once with a spoon and said, "Before we continue celebrating, I need to address something as a family." My father moved first. I saw panic flash in his face, then calculation. He stepped forward with his palms open, using that calm voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "Dad, before you say anything, I think everyone should know, Myra has been going through a difficult time." Mom came to his side with her handkerchief already in her hand. Vanessa looked down like she was bravely enduring pain. It was almost impressive how quickly they formed a little stage. Dad told the room I had become distant after the accident. Mom said they had tried to reach me, but I was refusing contact and saying hurtful things. Vanessa added that there had been confusion about the night of the crash, and that my memory might not be reliable because trauma did strange things. That was the moment I felt something cold settle in me. They were not just minimizing what happened. They were trying to erase my ability to tell it. Lily pressed her face into my leg because the room had gotten too quiet, and I put my hand on her hair to steady both of us. A woman near me whispered, "Her poor parents." I looked at my father, and for 1 second he looked relieved. He thought it was working. Grandpa let the silence stretch after Dad finished. Then he said, "Are you done, Richard?" His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room cleanly. Dad blinked. "I just wanted the family to understand the situation." Grandpa nodded once and took the manila folder from the side table where I hadn't even noticed he'd placed it. "Then let's help them understand it." He opened the folder slowly, like he was not in a hurry because the facts were not going anywhere. First question. Who has been paying your mortgage for the last 8 years? Dad's face changed. Not completely. Not enough for everyone to catch it, but I caught it. The room that had been pitying me a minute earlier went still in a different way. Grandpa looked down at the first page and said, $2,400 a month, 96 consecutive months, paid from Myra's account. Dad stared at the folder like Grandpa had pulled a weapon out of it. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at Mom, which was the worst thing he could have done because everyone saw it. Mom's handkerchief stopped halfway to her face. Vanessa's perfect sad expression cracked, just for a second, but long enough for Aunt Eleanor to let out this quiet, humorless breath beside me. Grandpa didn't rush. He had spent 40 years asking questions people didn't want to answer, and he knew exactly what silence did in a room. "Richard," he said again, "who paid the mortgage?" Dad tried to laugh, but it came out dry. "Myra helped us occasionally. Families help each other." Grandpa looked down at the page. Occasionally is not 96 consecutive months. A murmur moved through the room, small at first, then spreading. One of my uncles leaned forward like he hadn't heard correctly. Mom finally found her voice and said, "She offered. We never demanded anything from her." That sentence should have made me angry, and it did, but not in the loud way I expected. It made me feel embarrassed for the younger version of myself who had mistaken being needed for being loved. Grandpa nodded as if Mom had made a useful point. "Fine. Let's say she offered. Did you ever tell the family she was the reason you still had that house?" No one answered. Grandpa turned a page. Mortgage payments totaled $230,400. Health insurance premiums, $76,800. Home repairs, car repairs, emergency bills, and additional transfers, roughly $45,000. Smaller payments related to Vanessa's business emergencies, $12,000. Vanessa's head snapped up at that. "That's not fair," she said. "I didn't know where all the money came from." Aunt Eleanor's voice cut in from beside me. "You knew enough to keep taking." Vanessa looked at her like she had been slapped, and for once she didn't have a pretty answer ready. Grandpa closed the folder halfway, then opened it again. Total support from Myra over 8 years is approximately $364,200. The sound that came after that was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was people inhaling, shifting, stepping back, rethinking every story they had accepted because my parents had looked normal while telling it. My cousin Rachel covered her mouth. An uncle near the back said, "Richard, what the hell?" Mom started crying, real crying this time, not the soft public tears she had used earlier. Dad's face had gone gray. He said, "She never complained. She always managed." Grandpa looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, she managed because you made sure she had no other role." That sentence hit me somewhere deep. It was so simple that I almost hated it. I had not been strong in their eyes. I had been convenient. Then Grandpa lifted his phone. I knew what was coming because I had sent him the screenshots, but my stomach still turned over. "There is one more fact this family needs," he said. On the night of Myra's accident, she was being transported for emergency surgery. Her children were at home with a babysitter who was leaving soon. She called her parents for help. Mom shook her head quickly. "Thomas, please." He didn't look at her. This was Helen's response, sent in the family group chat. He read it exactly. "You've always been a nuisance and a burden. We have Taylor Swift tickets with Vanessa tonight. Figure it out yourself." The room reacted before he could even lower the phone. Someone said, "Oh my God." Someone else whispered, "No." A cousin I barely knew took a full step away from my mother, like cruelty might rub off. Vanessa tried to save it. "You're taking that out of context," she said, but even she sounded like she knew the sentence had nowhere to hide. Grandpa turned his eyes on her. "Then provide the context." She looked at Dad. Dad looked at the floor. Mom sobbed into her handkerchief. Nobody said anything because there was no version of that night that made it better. Grandpa added, "Richard also wrote, 'You're a doctor. You're used to hospitals. Don't make this into a bigger deal than it needs to be.'" Vanessa responded with a laughing emoji. That was the part that made the room change for good. Money could be explained badly. Family favoritism could be softened. but a laughing emoji while your sister was going into surgery had a plain ugliness to it. Grandpa looked at me then. Myra, you don't have to speak, but if you want to, this is your moment. I hadn't planned on it. I had told myself the documents would be enough, that I could stand there quietly and let everyone else finally see it. But Lily was holding on to my dress, and Lucas was watching all the adults with wide, confused eyes. And I suddenly knew I did not want them to grow up watching me disappear inside someone else's version of me. So I handed Lucas to Eleanor, stepped forward, and said, I didn't come here to ruin a birthday party. I didn't even come here to ruin Mom and Dad. I came because they were already telling people I was unstable, and I am tired of being quiet so other people can look kind. My father flinched at that, but I kept going because if I stopped, I might never start again. I told them I had believed the family story for years. Vanessa needed support. I was practical. I was strong. I could handle it. I said I had paid because I thought helping my parents was love, and maybe, if I was honest, because I thought one day they would look at me and finally see a daughter instead of an emergency fund. My voice shook when I said that. I hated that it shook, but it did. Then I looked at my mother and said, that night in the ambulance, I was scared I might not come home to my kids. And you called me a burden because I interrupted your plans. Mom reached toward me. Myra, I was upset. I didn't mean it. I stepped back before she could touch me. You meant enough of it to send it. Dad meant enough of it to agree. Vanessa meant enough of it to laugh. The room went completely quiet. I took one breath and said the thing I should have said years earlier. I'm not sending another dollar. Not for the house, not for insurance, not for repairs, not for Vanessa, not for anything. If we ever have a relationship again, it will not be built on me paying for the privilege of being tolerated. Dad looked stunned, like the money stopping was somehow more shocking than the reason it stopped. That told me I had made the right decision. My parents left before Grandpa's cake was even cut. Nobody blocked the door, nobody begged them to stay, and that might have been the first real consequence of the night. Dad kept one hand on Mom's back as she cried into that handkerchief, but the way he looked around the room told me he was waiting for someone to defend him. No one did. Vanessa followed a few steps behind them, her chin down, her phone clutched in one hand like she wanted to disappear into it. For most of my life, rooms had bent around her. That night, the room let her walk out. After they left, the party didn't go back to normal because it couldn't. People were careful with me at first, almost too careful, like I might break if they said the wrong thing. Then my great-aunt Ruth came up and took both my hands in hers. She said, I'm sorry, sweetheart. I believed them when they made it sound like you were distant. That was the first apology, and it opened something. Cousins I barely knew came over one by one. Some admitted they had thought I was cold. Some said Vanessa had told them I looked down on the family because I became a doctor. One uncle just stood in front of me, shook his head, and said, $364,000, and they called you a burden. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It spread quietly, which was almost more painful for them. The family group chat went silent, then vanished completely after someone deleted it. 3 weeks later, my parents weren't invited to Cousin Michael's birthday dinner. A month after that, Aunt Eleanor hosted Easter brunch, and their names weren't on the list. Nobody sent a formal announcement. Nobody declared a war. People just stopped pretending they hadn't seen what they saw. My mother called me from a new number 2 weeks after the party, and I let it go to voicemail. Her message said this had been blown out of proportion, that Dad was devastated, that family should move forward. She never said the words, I'm sorry. She never said, I should have come to the hospital. So I deleted it. 3 months later, Aunt Eleanor called while I was packing lunches for Lily and Lucas. She said, they're selling the house. I had to sit down, even though part of me had known it was coming. Without my payments, the mortgage they had pretended to handle suddenly became real. Uncle Frank let them stay in his guest house, but even that came with conditions. Dad had to get a part-time job at a hardware store. Mom started doing bookkeeping for a local church. I thought I would feel satisfied hearing that, but mostly I just felt tired. Not guilty exactly, just tired of realizing how much of their comfort had come from my exhaustion. Vanessa called 6 months after Grandpa's party. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. She said she wasn't calling for money, and I almost laughed because that was how bad things had gotten. Then she apologized. Not perfectly, not enough to fix anything, but more honestly than I expected. She admitted she liked being the favorite. She admitted she didn't ask where the money came from because asking might have ruined the version of herself she enjoyed. She said, "When you were in that ambulance, I laughed. I keep hearing myself say that in my head." I told her the only useful thing I could think of. Then start there. Don't make it about being forgiven. Make it about becoming someone who would never do that again. She cried, and I let her cry, but I didn't rescue her from it. A year after the accident, my life looked smaller from the outside, but bigger from the inside. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment 5 minutes from the hospital, close to a good school district, with sunlight in the kitchen and enough space for the twins to run in circles before bedtime. The money that used to leave my account every month now goes into Lily and Lucas's college fund. Grandpa Thomas became part of our weekly routine. Every Sunday, he takes the twins somewhere, usually the zoo or the park, and then pretends he did not buy them ice cream before dinner. Aunt Eleanor comes over twice a month, sometimes with food, sometimes just to sit at my table and talk like I am not a problem to be managed. Marcus and I stayed friends too. He never made a big performance out of being there. He just kept showing up, and that still means more to me than I know how to explain. I still don't know what will happen with my parents. Maybe one day they'll understand what they did without needing to soften it first. Maybe they won't. But I don't build my days around that question anymore. For years, I thought if I gave enough, stayed quiet enough, and needed little enough, they would finally see me as worth loving. Now I know I was never supposed to buy my place in my own family. I was not a burden because I stopped carrying them. I was just finally honest about how heavy they had become. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it hit close to home, please like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this reach the people who are still being told they are selfish for having limits. I'd really love to hear what you think in the comments. Have you ever had to stop helping someone who kept calling you ungrateful? Do you think Myra should ever let her parents back in if they apologize for real? And what would you have done after seeing that message in the family group chat?